Hello, Bill. It is so
Um,
exciting to talk to you. I'm in Tel Aviv and you
Okay.
are in California.
Yep.
And eh, I would like to tell our viewers on Status Magazine that it is a big honor to have you as a contributor monthly to our magazine. It's the most exciting piece every month. I always look forward to it myself. And
Well,
I'm so
honor is
happy.
mine.
I'm so happy that you agreed to have a little conversation with us today because you shared with me something very interesting that shortly you are going to share with our audience. Um, I would like to first ask you to tell us a little a bit about yourself for those of our viewers who are meeting you for the first time. Bill, a little bit about yourself, please.
Okay. Yeah, I guess my background is all military. My father was in the Air Force. He enlisted for World War II. He liked it so much that he stayed in, got out for a year, and then he went back in and stayed in, and retired from the Air Force as a Sagan Aluf, as a lieutenant colonel. I went to West Point, which is West Point it was an all Army school. Nowadays, of course, the Air Force Academy exists, but I went to West Point. I always wanted to go to West Point, and I was able to go and graduated and went into the Air Force and remained in for a number of years and married an Israeli girl, got out, went to Israel. We lived in Israel for 3 years, and I joined the Halavir, and I participated in the Yom Kippur War. And then we returned, and I was able to get back into the U.S. Air Force and came back in as a strange. They had a rule that if you got out and you got back in, you came back into one rank younger. So I was both the youngest Rav Saren in the U.S. Air Force when I was 27 and the oldest Saren when I was about 41. And I started out as a captain again, and which is the rank of Saren. And I thought if I could just become a Rav Saren again, I would be happy. I did become a Rav Saren, but I got promoted, was sent to senior service school, and finished up as a major general, as an aloof. Um, Not a Tataloof, an aloof. And so I retired from the Air Force with 20 years service as an aloof, and I enjoyed my entire career. But so much I didn't even think about the differences, although there certainly were differences in being both in the Calavir and in the U.S. Air Force. And so I am Narit and I are both in a Havara here, and someone asked me about the differences and some questions, and so I said, well, I'll put together a presentation. So this started as a presentation just for the Havara, but that was about 5 years ago, and I have kept it current and tried to bring it up to date with how things are currently. So I wanted to give it, and I call it the Jewish experience in the U.S. Armed Forces. And amazingly, at the end of this, our listeners or our viewers will know more, I think, than not only most Jews who have served in the Air Force, but also many non-Jews who just don't know all these things that happen to exist. So, at any
So
rate,
this is very exciting. I, of course, saw the presentation that you will share now. I just want to say that it is very exciting to hear uh, the story of how the Jews have contributed to the US military for many, many, many years. Now that we are in war and the US military is helping us. So we will share now your presentation.
I already gave the introduction, right? I mean, as far as what the background was, I have the, I first started working on this 5 years ago, and I try to bring it up to date. Next slide, please. In the U.S., the Jewish participation started with the Revolutionary War in 1776. Now, the population of Jews was very small, it was only 2,500, including men, women, and children. But considering this, only 2,500 for men, women, and children, 650 Jews served in the Continental Army, which is extraordinary. And we also attained field grade Army officers, physicians, colonels, and lieutenant colonel in that war. And I won't say too much about them, except they were all heroes. They all participated in different ways. And one of them, David Emanuel, became governor of a state later after the war. But they all did very well. Next slide, please. The military academy, West Point, was established in 1802. And the first class, I would like to say, was 50% Jewish when it graduated. Now, I say that, but there were only two in that class. One was Jewish and one was not. The one that was Jewish was Cadet Simon Magruder Levy. And he had been a sergeant and had distinguished himself in the Battle of Fallen Timbers during the War of Independence. And his commander was the one that said, look, wait, there's this new military academy. I'm going to submit you as a candidate. And he was accepted. Today, there are over 1,000 Jewish graduates at West Point. And I'm somewhere among there, but I don't know where I was. I was in the class of 1959. Next slide, please. In the War of 1812, which was the second war that maybe the first after our independence that we participated in, the Navy had a guy who was an Aleph Mishneh, and he sank 5 British frigates. And so they were rather excited about that. And he was Jewish. And then we also had a Tataluf, a brigadier general, Joseph Bloomfield. And he later became governor of New Jersey. Next slide, please. The war with Mexico, which was the next one, we got a major general. And that was David Emanuel Twiggs. Now, he was not actually a practicing Jew, but his mother was Jewish, though. And so I've included him and such people in the presentation. Next slide, please. We also had Commodore Uriah P. Levy. He was a Navy guy, and he was the first career flag officer in 1863. And he was commander of the Mediterranean Fleet during the Civil War. Next slide, please. During the Civil War, it was a little bit different situation because in every war, there were more Jews as a percentage than there were of the population. And but not except for the Civil War. We did have 9 generals in the Army, 1 general in the Confederate Army, and that was Twiggs, who I'll show you later. I'll show you again, rather. The one that was in during the Mexican War was a general. And then the Secretary of War and also Secretary of State was Jewish. There were the highest decoration in the U.S. military in all services is called a Congressional Medal of Honor. And we had 7 of them during the Civil War that were awarded. We also had the first Jewish military chaplains, rabbis of both the U.S. Army and in the Confederate Army. Now, the interesting thing about that, unfortunately, is that the Confederate Army beat the Federal Army. They had they got rabbis before the Federal Army did. But both armies on both sides had rabbis and military chaplains. Next slide, please. Now, I asked the question, why is the Civil War the only war of the war of the United States in which Jews served in less than their population percentage? And the answer is because it was a conflict between country and state, and Jews served on both sides. And this picture I have here is of Major Alfred Mordecai. He was West Point class of 1823, and he was first in his class. And he fought in the Mexican War, but he was from a southern state. Now, you have to understand the thinking. I mean, the United States of America meant that these states were actually separate, and they did not consider themselves, those that fought in the Confederacy, did not consider themselves as traitors or anything. They just considered that that was their right to leave the war. And the leading Confederate general, as it turned out, was Robert E. Lee, who was very well thought of before that. And he was offered the command of all the United States forces, and he spent 24 hours. He couldn't, Lincoln offered him the command. He had been a lieutenant colonel, but it was very well thought of, and they really wanted him to be the commander of all the Union forces. And he thought it over, and he finally, after 24 hours, he said, I cannot draw my sword against my friend and neighbors. And so he resigned from the U.S. Army, and he went south. In other words, he went to his native state of Virginia. He was not a slaveholder, by the way. In fact, there's a big argument frequently about whether the war was fought for slavery or not. Ostensibly, it was. I mean, there was a big argument about it, but most Southerners say no, it was fought for states' rights. That we felt we had we wanted to do what we wanted to do, and we felt that this was a right of our state, and so they resigned. And that's so General Lee, he was from a very wealthy family in the South, and they owned slaves, but several years earlier, he had freed all of his slaves. He said, I don't believe in slavery. And what's interesting is he became eventually the leading general in the South, but he was totally against slavery. And he was one of the first to take the oath, which is what they did, to rejoin the Union. And interesting also about General Lee is General Grant, who was a commander of the Union, all the Union forces. He invited Lee to the White House after the war. And another interesting thing was that when before Lincoln was assassinated, right after the war, when it was announced that General Lee had surrendered and all the forces were, the United States had won the war, they have a personal Marine band, and he ordered the band to play Dixie, which was the national emblem, national march of the South, which was interesting. Now, Mordecai himself he resigned from the Army, the guy that was class of 1823. He had fought in the Mexican War, but he couldn't bring himself to stay in the Army, and he resigned, and he taught school in Philadelphia during the Civil War. His son was Alfred Mordecai, and Alfred Mordecai went into the Union Army and stayed in after the war and eventually became brigadier general before he retired. So this was really a war that was fought against one another. And it was very, I was actually contacted. I've gotten involved a lot with the Flying Tigers, who fought against the Japanese with the Chinese. And with Narit and also a former chief of staff of the Air Force, which is the highest ranking Air Force officer, we were asked to accompany 40 veterans of the Flying Tigers to China about 10 years ago. And because of that, they knew that I was a West Pointer. The Chief of Staff of the Air Force, the former Chief of Staff, he graduated the Air Force Academy. And they contacted me afterward about whether I would agree to go. They have their own military academy called WAMPO. And WAMPO was started by Sun Yat-sen, who was the father of modern China. And he started the academy, and he adopted almost everything from West Point, and it's known it came from West Point. And so I was contacted, and the Chinese asked me whether I would go to West Point. They were having a reunion from both sides in China, also from Taiwan, of graduates of WAMPO, and they wanted me to come and speak. And I said, well, look, I'll have to, it was going to be 6 months later. And unfortunately, I had a stroke then. And I said, look, I'd like to do this. I'll have to get government permission to do it if you really want me. In 6 months, maybe I will have recovered enough that I can do this thing. But it turned out I couldn't, so I never did this. But I asked him, I said, why do you want me? I am WAMPO, I know, is an Army academy. I was in the Air Force. And they said, that's not important. What's important is you graduate at West Point. They said, after the war, you came back together again, both sides. And we also had a civil war in which we had two sides that fought one another who were classmates from WAMPO. And so we would like to know how we can come back together again as you did in the United States. Well, as it turned out, I couldn't do this. I would have liked to do it, but I couldn't do it. So at any rate, so bad. Next slide, please. A little side story here. Here are 3 Union generals that were Jewish during the Civil War. Next slide. Well, here's Major General Twiggs again. Now, he went south. His mother was Jewish, and that's about all we hear from him. He did fight during the Civil War, and he fought for the South. Next slide. Here's Judah P. Benjamin. He became the Secretary of War and later the Secretary of State of the Confederate States of America. And after the war, he escaped. I mean, he was a Southerner, and he didn't know how the Union was going to handle this. So he went to England, and he wrote a famous law book there, and it became very well known in England. And interesting enough, had a totally different career after having done this. And but he was Jewish. Next slide, please. Well, I included the $200 or whatever. I was a Confederate because his picture was on it. The Surgeon General of the CSA of the Confederate States, Simon Baruch, was also Jewish. Next slide, please. Well, the next big war was the Spanish-American War, 1898. 5,000 Jews saw service, 20% higher than the U.S. population as a whole. And what's also interesting is the fact that 3 former Confederate generals, they had been in their early 20s when they were generals in the Confederate Army. They were all West Pointers. And they were asked to volunteer, and they rejoined the United States Army. And they fought for the United States again, rejoined the army that they once fought against during the Spanish-American War. And they were recommissioned as major generals, as I recall. Next slide, please. Well, World War I, 1917 to 1918, 250,000 Jews in the U.S. military, 5.7% of all soldiers serving versus 3.27% of U.S. population. So a much higher percentage than those that those that were in the population. Many Jew generals now was including 10,000 commissioned officers, 900 in the Navy, 100 in the Marine Corps. Next slide, please. The decoration on the right is the highest decoration in the United States military for all services. And this is one of the winners. He was Sergeant Kaufman. Benjamin Kaufman was a Jewish winner. We had a number of Jewish winners. He eventually became a brigadier general. Next slide, please. World War II, there were 550,000 American Jews in the U.S. military. I mean, this is stunning to me. 550,000. Them's a lot of soldiers and a lot of Jews. And my father was one. He enlisted for World War II. He'd been an attorney. He enlisted in. He had been an attorney, and they offered him a direct commission as a captain, which he turned down. He said, "No, I want to fight." And he went to officers candidate school. They gave him a waiver because he was overage. Went to officers candidate school and became a second lieutenant, a second missionaire, instead of a serin, which he could have been. And he couldn't. He was too old to fly, but he was in air intelligence, and he did fly some missions and in various intelligence missions, including on a submarine. I don't know what all got the letters, but I don't exactly know a lot of the stuff that he did. Represented approximately 5% of Americans who served, when the percent of Jews in the American population at the time was 3.3%. 6% were flying personnel. 20% of Jews serving were officers, including 19 generals and 3 admirals. Next slide, please. Now, I didn't know all this stuff, and I would venture to say that 98% of the American Jews had never heard that, and I don't think any of the non-Jews have heard about it. Major General Maurice Rose, he was commander of the 3rd Armored Division. He was which was the first U.S. unit to reach German soil. Unfortunately, he was killed during the war. Next slide, please. Mark Clark, nobody knew this, but he was Jewish. His mother was Jewish he was not practicing, but he was a World War II commander in Italy, the youngest lieutenant general and the youngest 4-star full general eventually during the war. And he was a UN Supreme Commander during the Korean War. And if you look at him, you can tell he's Jewish. We who are Jewish know that, yeah, that guy's Jewish, but I doubt whether 99% of those who weren't knew that Mark Clark was Jewish. Next slide, please. Oh, this is a kind of a tragedy and a victory. Benjamin Solomon was a dentist. Dentists, because of the shortage were Jews, were assigned as surgeons to various regiments. And he went overseas to the Pacific and was assigned as a surgeon. And his unit was overrun by Japanese. And he turned around, and there were several Japanese running around and bayoneting the soldiers that were wounded. And so he picked up a pistol and shot him. The next day, his body was found outside by a machine gun, and there were 96 Japanese corpses. And he was they couldn't. One of the problems, he didn't get the Medal of Honor until much later. I think much later president, because by the rules, the medical corps are not, by international law, are not supposed to fight. And he won this while fighting. And then after the war, during President Clinton, they decided that even though it was illegal for him to fight, he should get the medal anyway. I mean, he was killed; it was posthumous, but they did award the Congressional Medal of Honor to him, I think, during when President Clinton was president. Next slide, please. This is another story. He was the son of Vice Admiral James Kaufman, Rear Admiral Draper Kaufman. He was not Jewish by religion, but he was ethnically Jewish. And if you look at him, you can see he does have Jewish features. He was interesting. He founded the underwater demolition teams, UDTs, during World War II. They were called frogmen, and they were the predecessors of the Navy SEALs. He was awarded 2 Navy Crosses, which is awarded second to the highest awards of the Congressional Medal of Honor, and he became the 44th Superintendent of the United States Naval Academy. Next slide, please. Also, the atom bomb had Jews. First Lieutenant Jacob Bessler, he was a electronic countermeasure officer. He was the only man to fly on both atomic bomb missions to both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the guy in the between here is Sergeant Abe Spitzer. He was a radio operator on the Nagasaki mission. These, of course, ended World War II. Next slide, please. Again, that's the Congressional Medal of Honor. That's the highest award. There were 19 identified Jewish recipients since the award was established during the Civil War. Next slide, please. This is Airman, later Sergeant John Levital. He was one of only 2 Air Force sergeants to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor in the Vietnam War. And he was Jewish. Next slide, please. This is Jack Jacobs. He won the Congressional Medal of Honor also. He was in the Army. He was a first lieutenant when he won it, also during the Vietnam War. He was an infantry officer. Next slide, please. The Talsics were an interesting story because when I was in Israel, I got a letter from Captain Talsik. Captain in the U.S. military is like an Alf Mishneh, and he wrote me that he didn't say he said very little about me. He had read I read an article that I'd written about body armor, and he wrote that he was wounded. He didn't tell me anything about his whole story, but he was wounded during Pearl Harbor, and that's as much. And I never got a chance to even respond to him, which is a shame. He passed away shortly after that. He was the youngest Navy captain of World War II, and he was Jewish. And during Pearl Harbor, he had just graduated from Annapolis, so he was still a young ensign. And he commanded a gun crew, and he was the Japanese strafed it, and his leg was in really bad shape. And he was the captain of the gun crew, and he refused to be evacuated. He stayed there, and one of his gunnery sergeants, I think the senior gunnery sergeant, said, "Sir, I am taking you to sick bay." And Ensign Towson said, "No, you're not." And he said, "Sir, I'm refusing to obey your order." And his taking him to sick bay during the battle saved his life, but he lost his leg, and they couldn't do anything about it. But he was the youngest captain or Aleph Mishneh during World War II in the American Navy. I talked with his son. I was trying to get some information. I was president of the West Point Society of Los Angeles, and I was trying to get some information. I forget why, about I didn't know what happened to. I knew that he had a son that also graduated from the Naval Academy, and I contacted the president of the Naval Academy Association, and they did the research for me, and they located, and I talked to him. He was class of 1966 from Annapolis, and he didn't go in the Navy, went in the Marine Corps. And he wrote me, he said, when he decided to go in the Marine Corps, he got letters from all kinds of admirals. Now, remember, his father was an admiral, and his grandfather was an admiral. And he got letters from a lot of classmates from his father, and they acted as if he decided to become a communist or something. I mean, because he wasn't going in the Navy, he was going in the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps was a part of the Navy for many, and it's still considered working for the Navy to some extent. But at any rate, he had served in the Marine Corps, served in Vietnam, and then left to go into some other occupation. But it was interesting that his background was quite interesting. Next slide, please. Your War of Independence, Israel's War of Independence. First, all of you know about David Marcus, and he was West Point class of 1924, and he was killed, as you know, as he was commander of the Jerusalem Front. And I frequently hear that Well, and actually he was the first Hebrew general since ancient times, in his promotion to Tataluf. But at any rate, he was unfortunately, he was killed by an error by a sentry. And then what I didn't know until much later, and I'm sorry I didn't, because if I known this, I would have contacted this guy when I was in Israel, because this is Paul Schumann. Paul Schumann was as a Sagan Aluf, was the ranking officer and the commander of the Israeli Navy during the War of Independence. And that's him on the right, with Ben Gurion. And he was, was very difficult for him. Very difficult for any American, I think, that goes to Israel. Is we have to learn Hebrew, and it's difficult for us to, just doesn't come very easy. And so he would have to go to meetings, staff meetings, with a translator. And he was resented a little bit, but he had combat experience. He had graduated the Naval Academy in 1945, and he'd gone into combat right away on a cruiser against the Japanese. So he had the background for it. But after the War of Independence, he left the Navy and he served in Israel. He started a consulting company. And unfortunately, if I'd known this, I would have contacted him when I lived in Israel, but I didn't until much later. But he was posthumously, I went to Israel to speak a couple of years ago, and the ranking person there was General Admiral Ben Bashat, who was the commander of the Israeli Navy. And he told me that he was promoted when he died, they posthumously promoted him to Rear Admiral. And, and so I had an interesting background. But at any rate, so Americans participated in that also, who started out in the American Armed Forces. Next slide, please. This is Captain, later Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Feinstein. He was Air Force Academy class of 1964. He was one of 3 U.S. Air Force aces that shot down 5 enemy planes during the Vietnam War. And that's him on the left. Next slide, please. This was in F-4 Phantoms. This is just a Hanukkah in Baghdad in 2007. I was not there, by the way, but I thought this interesting to show you that we're having Hanukkahs all over the world now because of this and other holidays we celebrate. Next slide, please. These are, unfortunately, 3 of the 60+ Jews that were killed fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. David Bernstein was military academy. I won't go into all the deeds that these guys did. He was killed leading his troops, in Iraq. And then there was Rosalind Schulte and Captain Michael Pawlowski. He was Rutgers University class in 1996. Next slide, please. This was from Afghanistan. Christopher Shuttless. He was a Ranger, killed, Medal of Honor winner. He died because he stayed behind because others were not able to, and they took care of it. He was the only one killed from a group of Rangers that were on a special mission. Next slide, please. This is in the Marine Corps. The Marine Corps had their first Jewish Marine general in 1876. I don't have his picture here, but I do have of these 3 who were ranking. The one on the right was a Commandant of the Marine Corps, General Kulak, and the one on the left, although I met this one here recently. I was speaking at LAX, had a special thing because a guy who had been both a Marine and flown during World War II, and then he also flew in the Israeli Air Force during the War of Independence, and he was the one that led a group of converted Messerschmitts, ME-109s, with different engines under the wrong engine, underpowered engine, which is all we could get. And he led led a flight. I think it was a suicide mission. These airplanes had been packed up and flown to Israel, unpacked, glued back together again. And of course, you never fly airplanes like that in that condition. I mean, you have to test fly them and make sure you don't know what wings are going to fall off or not. I mean, you make sure what it is. And so they called this guy up and they said, Lou Leonard, who died only 2 years ago, I believe. And because he had been a captain in the Marine Corps, he was made at least given an honorary title of operations officer of the Israeli Air Force. And so they called him up and they said, you have to attack this column of tanks and trucks, which is quite large, which is heading right for Tel Aviv. And Leonard said, sir, I'll be very happy to do that, but we have to test fly these airplanes today. And then tomorrow we'll attack. I'll be happy to lead attack. And they said, if you don't take these airplanes and attack them now, there may not be any Tel Aviv tomorrow, because it's a large column. I think there were 15,000 in the column. And so he did, and he did lose one flyer, and but the others survived, and it was a successful mission. I mean, it scared the heck out of the Egyptians, and they turned around and the whole column went back to Egypt. The general on the left, General Magnus, led a group of Marines that when they had a special event celebrating Lou Leonard's life. And the Marine Corps donated one of the airplanes that he flew against the Japanese, and they put it in a museum at LAX. There's a restaurant not far from the airport, and they have a museum. Those of you who might have been out there know that they have a museum of different company airplanes. Well, they now have a Marine Corps airplane that the Marine Corps donated, and General Magnus, who was assistant commandant of the Marine Corps, spoke there, and I got invited there because just by the sheerest of accidents, I was at a party and I met the new air attaché, and someone introduced me and said, that Bill has been in the Israeli Air Force, and he asked me, he said, why don't you come tomorrow? And we're having the Marine Corps is going to be there, and we're going to have a party celebrating the life of Lou Leonard. And so I did go, and the Marine Corps really did upright. They also had the commander of the squadron that he had served in, not the same commander, obviously, but the one that was commanding now, also was there, and they were in full uniform and everything, and they did it upright, presented the airplane and so forth. So at any rate, next slide, please. This is Aaron Bank. He's known as the father of the Green Berets. And I knew about him because a company mate of mine at West Point's father was a Green Beret and reported to Colonel Bank. So he actually founded the Green Berets, and known fact, of course, he's Jewish. Next slide, please. These are two other Jews that were in Special Forces. Special Forces are like Sayeret. I was also, by the way, in the Special Forces in the Air Commandos during the Vietnam War. My airplanes were two. I was in B-52s, which were nuclear bombers, and then I always wanted to be a commando. And when the Air Force started this thing, I tried to volunteer out of that, and they wouldn't let me go because the B-52 guys wanted to hold on to me. But what they wanted me to get a master's degree, which is really funny in a way, because I graduated from West Point with the lowest math average since George Armstrong Custer graduated in 1861. But the Air Force felt that I needed to get a master's degree, and sent me off there anyway. But these two guys here were both in Special Forces, And Bull Simons was the one for the, got these civilians out for, I forgot what the company was, but he led them out. And then Shachnow died recently, unfortunately, but he commanded all of the special forces, and he was a Holocaust survivor. And he had actually, and so he was, he had done quite a lot in his life. And he was an immigrant, and he joined the Army. Did not go to West Point, by the way, and but stayed and eventually commanded the entire U.S. Army Special Forces. Next overhead, please. The Navy had 4 Jewish officers. I always talk about it. You hear that, oh, the Navy is so anti-Semitic, you don't have this, you don't have that. They had 4 who reached the rank of full admiral, 4 stars. The most well-known, of course, is Admiral Rickover, who was the father of the nuclear submarine. That's on the lower left. But you know about Admiral Bloch. He was a commandant of the U.S. fleet from 1938 to 1940. Or Moriel, Ben Moriel was the father of the Seabees, which were the engineers, seaborne engineers. This was 1946. And finally, Admiral Burdo was chief of naval operations. And he was also a non-Annapolis grad. He enlisted in the Navy and worked his way up to full admiral, and eventually was the chief of all the chief of naval operations, or like the chief of staff of the Air Force, the Commandant of the Marine Corps. They were the senior officer in their service. Next slide, please. This is 2 historic tours were dedicated aboard the USS Truman, which is an aircraft carrier. Next slide, please. Oh, and Norty Schwartz. This officer here was a special force officer, and he became chief of staff. And he and I were both at senior service school at the same time and knew each other. I did not know he was Jewish then. And but we became friends. And then when I became a general, there's a couple tours that you make a tour of all the bases and so forth. And when I went to the Air Commando school, my escort officer, I was a new brigadier general, and this was my escort officer. He was a full colonel then. And in those days, the Air Force were not promoting special forces officers to general. I was probably I don't know whether I was first or not, I didn't research that, but he was very excited that I had been promoted to general. And then he was, shortly after that, he was promoted. The next year, 2 years later, he became a brigadier general. And eventually he became a 3-star and then a 4-star general, which is a full general. It's higher than you don't, in Israel, you don't have the kind of rank, but this kind of guy commands about 2 million men. I mean, this is like Eisenhower. I mean, they really quite a few. And so when he became chief of staff, I have written books. I didn't write all those books that are in the background there, but I've written some of the books that you can see behind me. And so I sent him a book, and I said, "Dear Norty," I said, if I'd known you would become chief, I would have treated you a lot better." And this, so I knew him from that. And he was the first Jewish Air Force chief of staff from the Air Force. And next slide, please. And then 2 years later, General Goldfein became chief of staff. Now, I did not know General Goldfein, so I did not send him a special book or a joke or anything like that. But General Goldfein's father was I think he was an Air Force colonel. His brother was a major general, and then General Goldfein became chief of staff of the Air Force. So we had 2 chiefs of staff within about 5 years, and which was, I think, extraordinary. Now, nobody advertised that they were chiefs of staff. I mean that they were Jewish, but that's what they were. Next slide, please. Now, I figure we got to have one general who is a 3-star, and that's General Weinstein. He's known as the father of the military academy, and he graduated at West Point in 1956. In other words, he was my upperclassman. I knew him because we had a Jewish chapel squad. I'm sorry that you hear in the back one of our two dogs, and he's letting everybody know that he's part of this thing too. And General Weinstein was in the Jewish chapel squad when we had a small chapel squad, but we had to, in those days it was required that you either you had to indicate you were either Protestant, Catholic or Jewish. That was a requirement. And so we had at that time, about 40 Jews were going through the military academy. And he was one of my first classmen, and he was in the chapel squad. So I know this guy, and I started coming in here primarily for that reason. But he is known as the father of the U.S. Military Intelligence Corps. Next slide, please. Had to include my family. That's my dad there on the left. He retired as a kind of wolf. He absolutely loved the Air Force, and he raised me the same way. I mean, I enjoyed it. I can see where he really liked it. I enjoyed it also. I mean, when I was a kid, we used to go to the officer club, and all the pilots would all hang out together and talk about flying and so forth. And they made me like I was like a junior airman. I mean, and so I grew up in the Air Force, and I liked it a lot, and I joined it also. My son, however, went in the Army. My son was an infantry officer. He was jump qualified. He was Ranger qualified. All the good stuff, and he was doing great. But he wanted to be an attorney, and when he stayed 5 years because they allowed 5 years was a minimum requirement. But starting with his class, it was during the drawdown, and you could get out after 1 year. You could leave the military because they didn't have this law for you. He stayed in for 5 years anyway, and then he went into he was in special forces as well. And then he called me up one day and he said, "Dad," he says, "I've been accepted for law school, and I'm going to have to leave the Army." He said, they want me to go to the advanced course, and if I can't do that and be an attorney, so I'm leaving. I said, "Well, it's up to you. It's your career. It's your life. You do what you want to do." That's what he did. And there on the right is one of the few that outrank me. My wife was a Rav Torah in the Chayran, and she still runs a lot of the shows. In fact, she wanted to sit in with me here so she could tell me what to do. I said, "No, I've already got some folks who can do that for me anyway." So anyway, that's her on the right. And with that, I finish my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll be happy to answer.
Oh, sure. We enjoyed it very much. It's amazing. I really think that we have a very special treat for all of our viewers and readers, and the audience of our management magazine know you as a professor and as a student of Peter Drucker, but now we got into all the secrets of Jews contributing to the U.S. Military. Now, before we finish, we are at war now, and we collaborate with the U.S. military. We are supported by them. So it's really very special to be able to show that the Jewish people helped them many, many years in the United States. You showed a very long history. Is there anything that you would like to share with our audience before we finish regarding any insights that could be of value for us at this current situation?
Well, I think that I just want to stress that there are a lot more Jews than you might think that you run into in dealing with the U.S. military. And as far as the U.S. military goes, one of the things I notice is every time I turn on the TV and they have a retired something, officer or enlisted or sergeant or something to speak about the situation right now and our war with, the war with Hamas and everything. And there's always agreement with the way that Israel is handling this war. With the politicians and the newsmen, it's kind of spotty sometimes. I mean, you get the feeling that they're, they're thinking primarily, well, they're going to get, how they're going to make out in the next election. But but the military, I think as far as Israel goes, I think the U.S. and Israel are very much in sync. And I have not heard a general or a sergeant or anyone who fights saying that, gee, if I was Israeli, I'd do things differently. So, and my feelings are the same. So, at any rate, I know this is a tough time, and wars are tough, and I'm sure that Israel will come out as it is coming out the way it should for this way this with nothing that Israel started, but has adapted to it and will have ultimate success.
Thank you so much, dear Bill, and I hope that next time we talk in better times. But it was very special that we could get this conversation with you, Major General Bill Cohen. And it's a lot of inspiration that Jews can fight and can do great things in war, as you showed in the history of Jews in the US Army, in addition, of course, to our history. I guess that right now, in the support that was sent from the US in our direction here, there probably are some Jewish people too. Maybe we'll find out about them in the future. So maybe it's a good cause to try and identify them and talk to you later about them next time after the war. So take care and thanks a lot. And let's have a better future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Thank you for asking. Bye bye.